Episode 12, Chronicles of Stone. Theodor Schvindt stands on a hillside overlooking Lake Ladoga, his journey nearly complete. It is autumn 1883, 4 years since he began his travels through this region in 1879. The birch leaves have turned and are falling, carpeting the ground in gold. The lake stretches before him, gray-blue and vast, its surface ruffled by wind. Islands dot the water, some near, some distant, all silent and enigmatic. He has been walking for 4 years through these landscapes, from village to village, from ruin to ruin, from graveyard to graveyard. Season after season, year after year, he has returned to continue his work. His notebooks are full, crammed with stories, place names, folk beliefs, detailed descriptions of fortress walls and ancient stones and sacred sites collected across multiple journeys, multiple summers and autumns spent among these people and these stones. His mind is fuller still, carrying images and voices and narratives that will take years to process and understand. And as he stands looking over this landscape that has given him so much, he realizes something profound: he is reading. Not a book, not a manuscript, not any text inscribed on parchment or paper. He is reading the land itself. Every stone, every hill, every island, every place name is a word in a vast text. The landscape is a chronicle, not written in ink but carved in granite, not preserved on pages but embedded in geography, not housed in a library but spread across hundreds of square kilometers of earth and water. This is what Chronicles of Stone means. The monasteries burned, and their written chronicles turned to ash. The old knowledge keepers died, and much of what they knew died with them. The wars came and went, destroying and displacing, erasing and transforming. But the stones remained. The land remained. And in the stones and the land, the stories persisted, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough that Schvindt could walk this landscape and reconstruct, at least partially, the history written in its stones. Enough that we, more than a century after his journey, can walk with him and read that same chronicle, those same stones. This is the final chapter. This is where we stand with Schvindt on that hillside and look back across everything we've encountered, and forward to what it means and why it matters. This is where the individual stories become a single story, the story of how memory survives in landscape when all other vessels of memory fail. This is the chronicle written in stone. The first stone, the giant's mark. Look there, at the base of the hill. Do you see them? The massive boulders, far larger than a man could move, arranged in patterns that are not quite natural. Some people call them the giant stones, metallolace kivet, markers left by the ancient people who preceded the Karelians, who were larger or stronger or simply other. This is where the chronicle begins, with the deepest past, the time before memory. The metallolace, whether Sami peoples, earlier Finnic groups, or simply the projection backward of current peoples into a mythologized past, these giants left their marks. They built the first fortresses, cleared the first fields, placed the first stones. Or so the stories say. And whether the stories are literally true matters less than what they represent. The acknowledgement that this land has been inhabited for longer than current memory reaches, that layer upon layer of human presence has accumulated here, that we are not the first and will not be the last to call this place home. The giant stones anchor the chronicle. They say, the story begins before we can clearly see, before we can accurately remember, in a time of myths and legends that blend into history so gradually that no clear boundary exists between them. Every culture needs an origin point, a beginning to its story. For the Lake Ladoga Karelians, that beginning was the giants, not fully human, not quite gods, but something in between. The transitional figures who shaped the raw landscape into a place where humans could live. And their stones remain. You can walk to them, touch them, verify their existence. The chronicle is not merely metaphorical but physical, tangible, real. The second stone, the fortress walls. Climb with Schvindt now to the summit of one of the Linnavuret, the fortress mountains that crown so many hills around Lake Ladoga. Feel beneath your feet the stones that someone placed here, deliberately, laboriously, creating walls that would defend their communities against enemies. These stones tell a different story than the giants' boulders. These speak of war, of threat, of communities organized enough to undertake massive communal labor projects, of the grim calculus that decided, we must build defenses or we will not survive. The fortress walls write chapters about strategic thinking, about the geography of conflict, about how borderland peoples navigate existence between empires. They map power and vulnerability onto the landscape. These hills were valuable enough to defend, these approaches needed to be blocked, these sight lines needed to be controlled. And they persist. The walls have collapsed, yes, scattered by frost and time and the patient work of tree roots. But their traces remain clear enough that Schvindt could map them over his 4 years of travels, could estimate their original heights and extents, could understand their defensive purpose. In their persistence, they testify, we were here, we defended this place, we built something meant to last. The peoples who built these walls are gone, absorbed into later populations, displaced by war, their specific identities lost. But their works remain, and through their works, we know them. The chronicle written in fortress stones is one of determination and vulnerability, of strength channeled into protection, of communities that cared enough about survival to move thousands of tons of rock up steep hillsides and arrange them into walls. The third stone, the blood-soaked earth. Descend now from the fortress heights to the fields below. Walk across Sakuraro, where the grass grows green now but where, centuries ago, blood soaked into the soil knee-deep, where hundreds died and were buried in mass graves, where the earth itself remembered the violence for 7 times 7 years. These stones, the stones of battlefields, write the darkest chapters. They record not the abstract fact of war but its visceral reality, the specific places where violence concentrated, where the cost of imperial conflicts was paid in peasant blood. At Sakuraro, at Silankova, at Elisanvara's mass grave, at every battle site, the stones bear witness. Sometimes literally, you can dig and find bones, can unearth rusted weapons, can discover the physical evidence of violence. But more often metaphorically, the stones mark places that communities remember as sites of tragedy, that carry weight in folk memory, that transform ordinary geography into memorial landscape. The blood-soaked stones chronicle suffering, yes, but also endurance. The fields where battles raged are fields again. Life returned. Communities rebuilt. The violence was not final, not absolute, not the last word. The stones remember the killing, but they also remember the survival. The fourth stone, the lake bottom. Stand at the water's edge now, looking out across Lake Ladoga's expanse. Somewhere beneath those waves, the stories say, lie the bells of Kanansari and Hainasenma, cast into the depths when enemies approached, hidden where looters could not reach. These stones, the ones that mark where bells were thrown, or the stones piled atop the bells to keep them submerged, write chapters about what we try to save when everything else is lost. Not the buildings, not the material wealth that could be replaced, but the irreplaceable, the bells whose voices had called the faithful to prayer for generations, whose tones were woven into the community's sense of sacred time. The bells beneath the water chronicle hope and tragedy intertwined. Hope that what was hidden could someday be recovered, that the rightful heirs would return, that destruction was temporary. Tragedy that the recovery never came, that the bells sleep still in darkness and cold water, that their voices are silenced except in legend. But also, and this is crucial, the stones chronicle the success of the hiding. The bells were not looted, not melted down, not lost to enemy hands. They remain, if they remain at all, exactly where they were placed by those who loved them. The hiding worked. The bells are safe, even if unreachable, preserved in depths against the day, if it ever comes, when they can be raised and rung again. The lake bottom stones write a chapter of absence that is also presence, of loss that is also preservation, of silence that waits to become song. The fifth stone, the marsh refuge. Walk now into the wetlands, the marshes where Vepsa hid, breathing through a hollow reed while hunters searched above, where he endured cold water and desperate fear to become the last survivor of Lapinladi's burning. These stones, the markers of hiding places, the rocks that might provide shelter, the boundaries between dry land and marsh, chronicle individual stories of survival against impossible odds. They record not the sweep of armies but the experience of a single person, the choice to endure anything rather than surrender, the stubborn will to live. The marsh stones also chronicle loneliness and burden. Vepsa survived, but survival meant becoming the sole carrier of memories no one else shared, the only witness to atrocity, the last voice that could speak for the dead. The marsh gave him life, but it also gave him a weight he would carry until his own death. These stones remind us that grand historical narratives are made of individual stories, that every battle casualty was a person, that behind every statistic of war was someone like Vepsa, terrified, determined, human. The sixth stone, the hero's furrows. Return to Vekokangas, where the land bears furrows platform high, where the earth was shaped by strength so great it seemed superhuman, where Jaco Puntus, man or giant or something in between, left his mark. These stones chronicle heroism, the emergence of individuals whose abilities or actions so exceed the ordinary that they enter legend. The furrows, the bridges, the cleared paths, all attributed to Puntus, map achievement onto landscape, transforming geography into biography. But they also chronicle the human need for heroes. Whether a historical Jaco Puntus actually created these landscape features matters less than the fact that communities needed to believe in him, needed to have a figure who represented their own best possibilities, who showed that the weak could overcome the strong through cleverness and determination. The stones of Puntus's achievements chronicle aspiration as much as accomplishment, the projection of communal values onto landscape, the transformation of a shepherd into a giant killer and builder, of an ordinary man into an eternal guardian. The seventh stone, the cliff of choice. Stand now at Imphara, at the cliff edge where the daughters walked hand in hand, where they chose death over dishonor, where they stepped into air singing, where the lake received them into its cold embrace. These stones, the cliff itself, the rocks at its base where bodies struck water, chronicle the specific vulnerabilities of women in war zones, the impossible choices created by gendered violence, the agency claimed in moments when all other agency was stripped away. But they also chronicle transformation. The daughters are not remembered primarily as victims but as guardians, as eternal maidens who watch from the mist, as brides of the lake who achieved a kind of sanctity through their choice. The cliff stones mark tragedy, yes, but tragedy transfigured into something sacred. These stones write a chapter about how communities remember and honor those lost to circumstances that should never have existed, how stories can provide dignity to deaths that violence intended to make degrading, how memory can be a form of justice when material justice is impossible. The eighth stone, the cursed ground. Walk carefully now across fields near Kaupala where 20 treasures supposedly lie hidden, where men from across the border came seeking gold with ancient maps and monastery books, where the old man laughed and told them the treasures burned beneath the earth, cursed against those who seek with greed. These stones, the ones that might mark treasure locations, or the ones placed atop treasures to conceal them, chronicle the relationship between material wealth and moral worth. They map greed onto landscape, showing where the search for riches led to failure, where desire consumed seekers, where the earth itself seemed to resist violation. But more deeply, these stones chronicle the community's values. By insisting that treasures were cursed, that only rightful heirs could claim them, that greed brought doom, the folklore protected sites from desecration, discouraged treasure hunting that would benefit individuals at community expense, and maintained moral order through supernatural sanction. The treasure stones write chapters about what communities protect and how, about the power of belief to shape behavior, about the guardianship that folklore can provide when material guardianship fails. The ninth stone, the sacred tree's absence. Come to Kaupala, to the place where the great Tuami once stood, where people brought first milk and first grain for generations, where spirits were fed and blessings obtained, where a drunken man from Jakima cut through centuries of tradition and suffered curse before the year's end. This stone, the marker of absence, the memory of where the sacred tree stood, chronicles the relationship between humans and the more-than-human world, the understanding that certain places and things demand reverence, that reciprocity must be maintained, that taking without giving brings consequences. The absence of the tree is itself part of the chronicle. The empty space where something sacred once stood writes a chapter about desecration and its costs, about the fragility of sacred sites, about how quickly the work of centuries can be undone by a single act of violation. But the stone also chronicles memory's persistence. The tree is gone, but the story remains. The site is still known, still marked in folk knowledge if not in physical form. The absence is remembered, and in that remembering, the tree's sacredness persists. The 10th stone, the graveyard markers. Sit with Schvindt now in Kalmistu, the graveyard, on Kekri Saturday as families gather to feast with their dead, to honor ancestors, to maintain bonds across the boundary of mortality. Touch the stones that mark the graves, the crosses simple or elaborate, the markers that say, "Here lies someone who mattered." These stones chronicle the daily practice of faith and family, the customs that governed ordinary life, the beliefs that made death bearable by understanding it not as ending but as transformation. They map kinship onto landscape. Here lie the members of this family, generation by generation, connected by blood and by memory. The graveyard stones also chronicle community continuity. As long as descendants visit, as long as the feasts continue, as long as the dead are honored, the community persists across time. The stones anchor memory, providing focal points for commemoration, ensuring that the dead are not forgotten. These are perhaps the most intimate stones in the chronicle, not grand fortifications or battlefield monuments but simple markers of individual lives, the democracy of death where everyone, eventually, gets a stone. The 11th stone, the foundation ruins. Come finally to Orchestra, to what remains of the monastery, scattered foundation stones, fragments of walls, the outline of where buildings once stood. These are the stones of destruction and loss, the remnants of cultural centers burned, the traces of knowledge turned to ash. These stones chronicle catastrophe, yes, the burning of the monasteries, the loss of chronicles, the destruction of centuries of accumulated learning. They mark rupture, the violent ending of traditions, the silencing of voices that had spoken for generations. But they also chronicle resilience. A new church stands nearby. The faith survived. The community persisted. The stones of the old monastery foundation remind us of what was lost, but the stones of the new church proclaim that loss was not final, that rebuilding happened, that faith could survive the burning of its physical and textual supports. These stones write the most recent chapters of the chronicle, chapters still being written, still unfolding, because the story is not over, because communities continue to navigate the tension between loss and persistence, between what was destroyed and what can be rebuilt. The chronicle's author. Who wrote this chronicle of stone? Not any single author, certainly. The chronicle was written collectively, across centuries, by every person who placed a stone deliberately, who fought at Sakuraro, who hid bells in the lake, who brought offerings to the sacred tree, who buried their family members in the graveyard. But also by the land itself, which received these human inscriptions and held them, which shaped how stones could be placed and what they could mean, which participated actively in the creation of meaning through its own geography and geology. And by time, which edited the chronicle ruthlessly, erasing some chapters entirely, preserving others in fragmentary form, creating the absences and silences that are as much part of the text as what remains visible. Theodor Schvindt's role was not as author but as reader and translator. He walked the landscape for 4 years, from 1879 to 1883, read the stones, listened to the people who could still interpret them, and wrote down what he found across seasons and changing light, returning again and again to ensure he understood, to capture nuances, to verify stories with multiple informants. His notebooks and eventual publications are translations of the Stone Chronicle into written text, preserving in ink and paper what was originally inscribed in granite and geography. Without Schvindt's patient, multi-year work, much of the chronicle would have become unreadable. The people who knew how to interpret the stones, who could say, "These are fortress walls, here Jaco Puntus plowed, this is where Mvara's daughters walked," were dying. The knowledge of how to read the landscape was fading. By recording that knowledge over 4 dedicated years, Schvindt performed a crucial act of preservation. He created a written version of the chronicle that could survive even after the last readers of the stone original were gone. But, and this is important, the written version is not a replacement but a supplement. The stones remain the primary text. We can still walk to Vekokangas and see the furrows, still stand at Imphara and look over the cliff, still touch the walls of Linavuret. The chronicle written in stone persists, available to be read by anyone willing to walk the landscape and see. What the stones remember. The stones remember everything and nothing. Everything, in the sense that the physical evidence persists. The arrangement of rocks in fortress walls, the composition of soil at battle sites, the depth of Lake Ladoga where bells lie hidden, these are facts, material realities that do not forget or distort with time. Nothing, in the sense that stones alone cannot tell their own stories. A fortress wall is just a pile of rocks unless someone knows it's a fortress wall. The furrows at Vekokangas are just geological features unless someone can say, Jaco Puntus made these. The cliff at Imphara is just a cliff unless the story of the daughters gives it meaning. The stones hold memory, but that memory must be activated by human knowledge, human storytelling, human willingness to read the landscape as text. This creates a vulnerability. If the human knowledge is lost, if the stories stop being told, if no one any longer walks the landscape with eyes to read it, then the chronicle becomes illegible. The stones remain, but their meaning is lost. They become mute, their stories locked inside them with no key. This is what Schvindt feared and what motivated his 4-year collecting work, that the key was being lost, that the generation who could read the stones was dying, that soon the chronicle would be closed, unreadable, effectively destroyed despite its physical persistence. His fear was partially justified. Much was lost in the 20th century, the border shifts, the wars, the population transfers that emptied Karelian villages, the ideological campaigns that suppressed folk traditions. Many stones that could have told stories fell silent because no one remained who knew how to interpret them. But much was also preserved, thanks to Schvindt and others like him. The stories were written down. The interpretations were recorded. The knowledge of how to read the landscape was captured in a form that could survive the loss of the original readers. And the stones themselves remain, waiting. Available to new readers, new generations, new interpreters who might walk the landscape and read it again, perhaps finding meanings that earlier readers missed. Chronicles in competition. The written chronicles that burned at Orchestra and the chronicle written in stone tell different kinds of stories and preserve different kinds of knowledge. Written chronicles excel at precision, at recording specific dates and names and sequences of events. They can preserve complex narratives, theological arguments, administrative details, all the things that require exact language and cannot be easily encoded in landscape. But written chronicles are fragile. They burn. They rot. They can be deliberately destroyed. And they require continuity of literate culture to be read. If the language changes or is lost, if the script becomes unfamiliar, the chronicles become illegible. The chronicle of stone is much more limited in what it can record. It cannot give you precise dates or name specific individuals, except through place names, which are themselves relatively imprecise. It cannot preserve complex arguments or detailed narratives. But it is durable. Stones do not burn. They resist rot and decay. And they can be read across cultural and linguistic changes. You can look at a fortress wall and understand its defensive purpose even if you don't speak the language of those who built it. The two types of chronicles complement each other. Ideally, you want both, the precision of written records and the durability of landscape inscription. But when you can have only one, when the written chronicles burn, the chronicle of stone becomes invaluable. It preserves what would otherwise be entirely lost. It keeps stories alive, even if in fragmentary and imprecise form, across gaps that would otherwise be unbridgeable. The Lake Ladoga region lost its written chronicles. But it retained its chronicle of stone. And through that stone chronicle, read and translated by Schvindt during his 4-year journey, we can still know something about the history and culture and experiences of people who lived centuries ago, who never imagined that their stories would reach us, who placed stones with local and immediate purposes but in doing so created a text that would outlast everything else they built. The 20th century's editions. Schvindt's journey ended in 1883. But the Chronicle of Stone continued to be written. The 20th century added its own chapters, painful, traumatic chapters written in the same landscape Schvindt had walked. World War I, the Russian Revolution, the Finnish Civil War, these conflicts touched the Lake Ladoga region, adding new layers of violence to landscapes already thick with the memory of earlier wars. The Winter War and Continuation War between Finland and the Soviet Union saw some of the heaviest fighting of World War II occur around Lake Ladoga. Fortress positions were built, 20th-century versions of the ancient Linnavuret, serving the same defensive purposes with modern weapons. New battlefields were created, new mass graves filled. And then came the most devastating inscription, the evacuation and resettlement. In 1944, when the border shifted and Karelia was ceded to the Soviet Union, the entire Finnish-speaking population was evacuated. Villages were emptied. Houses were abandoned. Graveyards were left untended. The people who could read the landscape most fluently, who knew the stories most intimately, were forcibly removed from the landscape those stories described. This created a new kind of silence in the chronicle. The stones remained, but many of the readers were gone. The places that had been someone's home, someone's sacred grove, someone's ancestors' graves became foreign territory to the descendants, accessible only through memory and through records like Schvindt's. New people moved into the emptied villages, Soviet settlers, often from other parts of Russia, who did not know the Karelian stories, who could not read the landscape in the old ways. They added their own chapters to the chronicle, their own meanings to the stones, but the continuity was broken. The Chronicle of Stone became, in some sense, a palimpsest, older meanings overlaid with newer ones, both present but not always visible simultaneously. Reading the chronicle today. What happens when we, in the 21st century, try to read the Chronicle of Stone that Schvindt translated in the 1880s? We bring our own perspectives, our own questions, our own methods. We have archaeological techniques Schvindt lacked. We have historical records he didn't have access to. We understand things about soil chemistry and landscape formation that inform how we interpret physical evidence. But we also lack things Schvindt had. We're farther from the oral tradition. We don't have access to living informants who heard the stories from their grandparents who heard them from their grandparents. We read the landscape through multiple layers of translation, the original inscription, Schvindt's interpretation, our own cultural frameworks. This creates both opportunities and challenges. We might see things Schvindt missed, make connections he didn't make, understand patterns that weren't visible from his perspective. But we also might misread, might impose meanings that weren't there, might miss subtleties that were obvious to those closer to the original contexts. The Chronicle of Stone is not fixed in meaning. It means different things to different readers at different times. This is both the limitation and the strength of landscape as text. It cannot speak for itself, cannot correct misreadings, but it also remains open to new interpretations, new understandings, new meanings. Every generation rewrites the Chronicle of Stone not by changing the stones but by reading them differently, by seeing different patterns, by asking different questions. Schvindt read the chronicle over 4 patient years looking for folklore, for the preservation of ancient customs and beliefs before they vanished, traveling and returning, listening and recording with the dedication of someone who understood he was capturing something that would soon be lost. We might read the same chronicle looking for different things, the experience of borderland peoples, the gendered dimensions of war, the intersection of religion and environment, the mechanisms of cultural memory, the patterns of trauma and resilience. The stones remain the same, but what we see in them changes. The permanence and impermanence of stone. There's a paradox at the heart of the Chronicle of Stone. Stones are both the most permanent and the most vulnerable of texts. Permanent in the obvious sense, granite endures for geological time scales. A stone placed 1,000 years ago is still fundamentally the same stone today. The material persists. But vulnerable because stones can be moved, can be repurposed, can lose their context and thus their meaning. The stones from a destroyed monastery might be used to build a barn. Fortress walls might be dismantled for building material. Sacred stones might be moved to clear fields for farming. When this happens, the physical stone persists but the chronicle is disrupted. The stone continues to exist but no longer speaks the same story, or speaks any story at all. And even when stones remain in place, they're vulnerable to the loss of interpretive knowledge. A fortress wall becomes just a pile of rocks when no one remembers it's a fortress. The chronicle is effectively destroyed even though the physical evidence persists. This makes the chronicle of stone simultaneously more and less permanent than written chronicles. More permanent physically, less permanent semiotically. The material outlasts the meaning. The solution is what Schvindt did: create written supplements to the stone chronicle, records that preserve the interpretive knowledge even if the stones themselves are moved or lose their context. The written record is more fragile physically but more stable in meaning. Together, stones and written records, material persistence and semantic preservation, the chronicle can survive across the gaps that would destroy either alone. The view from the hillside. Return with me now to where we began, Theodor Schvindt on a hillside, looking out over Lake Ladoga, his notebooks full, his 4-year journey nearly complete. He has walked this landscape across seasons and years, has read its stones in summer light and autumn rain, has listened to its stories in countless conversations, has translated its chronicle from granite into ink through patient, repeated inquiry. And now, in this autumn of 1883, preparing to depart, he sees it all as a whole, not individual stones or isolated stories but a single vast text, a chronicle written across the entire region, telling a story that is itself only a chapter in a larger story stretching back before human memory and forward into an unknowable future. The stones he has studied were placed by people who are now themselves stone, bones in the earth, names perhaps recorded in his notebooks but more often forgotten, individuals who have become collective, whose specific identities have dissolved into the category of ancestors, or the old ones, or those who came before. But their works remain. The walls they built. The fields they cleared. The paths they walked until the walking wore grooves in rock. The places they made sacred through centuries of offerings. The graves where they buried their dead and where their descendants, for a time at least, came to feast and remember. All of this is written in stone, is the chronicle, is the text that Schvindt has been reading. And he understands, standing on this hillside as the light fades and autumn deepens, that he is himself part of the chronicle now. His walking of this landscape over 4 dedicated years, his asking of questions, his writing in notebooks, this too is an inscription, a layer added to all the previous layers, a chapter in the ongoing story. The chronicle is not closed. It continues to be written. New stones will be placed, new meanings inscribed, new chapters added by people Schvindt will never meet, in times he cannot imagine, in languages perhaps that don't yet exist. But the old stones will remain. The old chapters will persist. The stories he has collected will continue, carried forward in his writings, in the landscape itself, in the stubborn persistence of memory encoded in geography. He has done what he came to do. He has read the chronicle. He has translated it for those who will come after, who will not have access to the readers he consulted, who will need his written record to decode the stones. And now, as darkness gathers and the wind off the lake grows cold, he begins his descent from the hillside, leaving the stones to their silent witnessing, the chronicle to its patient waiting. But before he goes, he places a small stone himself, not a marker, not a monument, just a stone, added to the countless others, his own tiny inscription in the vast text he has been reading. The chronicle of stone continues. The stories endure. The land remembers. And we who come after, we who read Schvindt's words and walk these landscapes, or imagine walking them, we too are readers of the chronicle, interpreters of the stones, participants in the endless conversation between past and present, between stone and story, between what was inscribed and what can still be read. Coda, the Song of the Stones. Chronicles of Stone, written on the land, every hill and valley shaped by human hand, from the giant's boulders to the fortress walls, from the bloody battlefields to the monastery halls. Every stone's a memory, every rock a page written by our ancestors across the turning age. Though the paper burns and the voices fade away, the stones remember still and have their say. Chronicles of Stone, beneath the northern sky, silent witnesses to all who lived and died. Though the world around them changes with the years, the stones remain and hold the ancient tears. They hold the joy as well, the hope that won't be broken. Every stone's a word and stories yet unspoken, and though we may be gone and our names may be forgot, the Chronicles of Stone will say that we were not. This is what the Chronicle of Stone ultimately offers, the assurance that we were here, that we lived, that we mattered, that our struggles and triumphs and ordinary days had weight and substance and reality. Long after names are forgotten and faces fade from memory, long after written records burn and oral traditions fall silent, the stones remain. They say, people were here. They built. They fought. They prayed. They loved. They died. They tried to preserve what mattered to them. They succeeded imperfectly but courageously. They are gone, but they were real. This is the gift of the Chronicle of Stone, witness. Memory. The refusal of time and forgetting to have the final word. The stones remain. The chronicle continues. The story endures. And we, for our brief moment, add our own words to it, place our own stones, inscribe our own meanings on the land before we too become part of the chronicle, part of the past, part of the story written in stone. Vecnea Pamyat, eternal memory. The Chronicles of Stone will keep it. The end. The journey through the Chronicles of Lake Ladoga is complete. From 1879 to 1883, Theodor Schvindt walked these lands, listened to these stories, and translated the chronicle written in stone into words we can read today. From the giants who shaped the land to the stones that remember them, from the fortress mountains to the fields of blood, from the bells beneath the water to the last survivors, from heroes to martyrs to seekers to the sacred and the dead and the burning places, all of it is written here, in stone and story, waiting to be read by those willing to walk the landscape and listen to what the land has to say. Thank you for walking with me. Thank you for listening. The stones remain, and the stories endure.